A common piece of advice I've heard in the self-improvement community is to base your productivity on output rather than results. For example, if you're a YouTuber, base your productivity on the quantity and quality of videos rather than metrics like views, subscribers, etc. that you get from the videos. This sounds like a good idea on paper. Instead of basing your success on factors you cannot control, you have direct control over your output. But after following it for a few months, I have found that this system has flaws and encourages many of the same bad thinking habits as using other metrics of success. It turns out control over productivity and success is only part of the problem. Like I've said in many other videos, productivity has been turned more into a buzzword than a useful tool. The problem is it's become too generalized, causing little distinction between work productivity and self-worth. Throughout the months I tried it, I found the same problems. It doesn't fix the root problem. Work productivity and self-worth must be distinct from each other. Otherwise, productivity becomes a requirement for self-worth, a toxic thinking habit, especially when you're on a low output. If you have low output, you feel unproductive, causing you to have low self-worth, which in turn makes you less motivated to continue working. This becomes a downward spiral. The truth is, some days you just aren't productive by any standard you value. But that isn't to say the day was a total waste. It could be the complete opposite. If you've ever heard of vacation, you might know what I'm talking about right now. Sadly, many of these quote-unquote productive routines and thought patterns leave no room for rest. Vacation can be as important for work as the work itself. There are a lot more factors to productivity and self-worth than sheer output, and the problems with how you gauge how productive you are exemplified by the correlation between self-worth and productivity. Without rest days, most normal people cannot keep working. That's perfectly fine and normal, something to be expected. So these systems of gauging productivity need to include factors such as rest to be useful and accurate. Otherwise, a few unproductive days can make you feel like a failure, when, in reality, you're just human. So you need to account for that. Set up your measure of productivity in a realistic world. Now, I'm not saying I do this to the extent I should, but instead of looking at your YouTube studio page before going to work, for instance, just focus on making good videos. Time is money, or rather, productivity. And in this case, it's not worth concerning yourself with metrics that could affect the quality of your work. Instead, set aside time to deliberately look at analytics with a steady mind, rather than worrying about them and letting your emotions get control of your productivity. This is the reason why so many streamers cover up their view count while streaming. It's a live analytical feed that takes your attention away from making good content and diverts it from your measure of success. The thing is, this system is just a different version of using metrics of success. Just instead of looking at views, you're looking at time between uploads or hours worked. And that can be just as unhealthy. I remember when I started out, I felt bad for not uploading for a few weeks. Even though I was sick, it was during the school year, and we had multiple vacations away from home. The system simply did not account for that, making me feel like I was doing worse than I should have been. You may notice I said should. That's something we're going to get into in a different video. I found the best way to stay productive and consistent at work is to, ironically, not base your success, fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, off of productivity. The last thing you want when you're unproductive is to feel unproductive and unmotivated. As I said before, this turns into a downward spiral. Instead of seeing these metrics and feeling bad about it, realize that you're here now, ready to work on something you hopefully want to do. That's what really matters to me. That's what I really base my productivity on. How much I enjoy working. Now, of course, I know you might have to make money and keep yourself alive, so this point might seem kind of insensitive, but all I'm saying is that it works for me. And I hope you can find a system that works for you, fitting in with your own requirements. In retrospect, it's painfully obvious that everyone needs their own systems of productivity. Of course, a software developer in a Fortune 500 company needs different productivity systems than a teenager making YouTube videos. This is also the problem I have with productivity based on output being called the quote-unquote best system of productivity. The thing is, metrics of success really do matter sometimes, especially when it comes to making money. And to say there is one correct way to measure productivity is incredibly naive. Everybody is different, and we all need different measures of productivity to account for that. Throughout this video, I've been talking about productivity like it's a word that has one definition. Of course, it gets confusing when there are different types of productivity, not to mention different factors that account for productivity. I'm just getting confused thinking about it. Many conflicts and disagreements in the world come from differing definitions of words, which is why it's important to clear up things like this. So here's how I like to think about it conceptually. There are different types of productivity: work productivity, health productivity, mental health productivity. They are individual sections of your life, each with their own measure of productivity, independent from each other. And there are different ways to define each individual type of productivity. An example would be, does watching YouTube videos in the same niche you make YouTube videos for count as work productivity? The answer changes your definition of work productivity. Then there are ways to define how productive you are in a specific type of productivity. Some examples would be metrics of success or output. I like to think of it as a scale, say 0 productivity to 100 productivity, with the scale measuring your productivity. Much like in real life, everybody has different scales for different use cases. Even a single person has different scales for work, health, or anything else they measure. The problem here arises from confusing different types of productivity, or, in other words, not having strict enough boundaries between these types of productivity, as well as creating a direct correlation between productivity and self-worth. Two different things entirely. I cannot stress this enough. Self-worth must be distinct from work productivity to have a healthy, sane life. Keeping that in mind, here are some measures of productivity, scales, if you will, to consider. Highest output per unit time. Basically, how much you can get done in a certain amount of time. Highest quality per output. This one's pretty self-explanatory, so to use the analogy of YouTube videos, the only analogy I seem to know how to use, it would be the best content you've ever seen, but they only upload once a year. Highest profit per unit of time, basically Mr. Beast. Highest enjoyment, again, pretty self-explanatory, just enjoying what you're making. I could keep going forever, but I think you get the idea. We all thrive in our own systems that account for our own needs. If Mr. Beast followed output as a measure of productivity, he wouldn't be where he is today, even though there is nothing wrong with how he does things. But we can all agree that if everybody were like Mr. Beast, YouTube would be a pretty boring and repetitive platform, even to Mr. Beast himself. And YouTube isn't that way, because everybody chooses their own ways to be productive, their own measures of success. Of course, in the real world, your scales will be vastly more complicated than the examples I have here. Vacation, for instance, is an important part that I left out. And, just like everything else, we have our own ways to approach it. That is all.